On the green hills of Vermont, nestled among maple and pine trees, stands a small wooden cabin where mornings begin with birdsong and sunlight breaking through the morning mist. This is where Mrs. Evelyn lives, 74 years old, silver hair usually tied in a soft bun, gentle eyes, and a smile that radiates peace, much like the land she calls home. Mrs. Evelyn is not famous. You won't find her on television or in magazines. But those who've met her, even just once, remember her stories about trees, the scent of wet soil, or how the forest breathes after rain. She represents a lifestyle that modern life is slowly forgetting. A life lived slowly, closely connected with nature, and true to oneself. It's not that she has never lived a fast-paced life. Before retiring, she was a school teacher in Boston, juggling lesson plans, meetings, and endless paperwork. But after her husband passed away, she felt an inner call for quiet, not just externally, but within. She found it here, among Vermont's pristine forests, a place where every step touches real earth, every breath is filled with the scent of trees, and time is no longer a race, but an experience to be savored. Each morning, Mrs. Evelyn wakes just as the first light peeks through the treetops. She doesn't need an alarm clock. The calls of birds, the rustling leaves, and the faint aroma of chamomile tea from the kitchen are her natural cues. After rinsing her face with cold spring water, she opens the windows wide to welcome the crisp, earthy morning air. She brews her own herbal tea, dried chamomile from her garden, and sits on a rocking chair on the porch. In front of her, a forest cloaked in mist, dewdrops glistening on the grass, and sparrows dancing in the sky. She calls this time the sacred hour, not because of rituals or religion, but because it's when the mind is clearest and most receptive to the subtle beauty of life. She doesn't check her phone or rush to do lists. Instead, she simply sits, breathes, and lets her senses touch the world. The sound of the creek, the scent of moss, the cool breeze through her hair. Each sensation is a gentle reminder. She is alive, present, and part of something greater. After a light breakfast, she slips into her wool sweater, laces up her old hiking boots, and steps outside. Behind her garden lies a winding trail, not found on any map, which she calls the path back to herself. Every step on that path is a letting go, of worries, of overthinking. Her feet crunch gently over fallen leaves, and her heart slows to the rhythm of the forest. She stops at familiar trees, pressing her palm against their rough bark, whispering silently to them. One particular maple has become her friend, tall, strong, silent. She believes trees can listen, and even if they can't, the act of reaching out grounds her. On some days, she pauses on a mossy rock, takes out a simple sandwich and water, and picnics with the forest. Squirrels dart nearby, birds call from above, and she speaks to them all. Beautiful day, isn't it? This trail is less than 2 kilometers long, but to her, it's a daily journey toward clarity, healing, and gratitude. Back at home, with clean hands and a soft heart, she sits by the window and opens a weathered leather-bound journal. Inside she writes, not novels or essays, just small things. Wind today carried the scent of wet pine. 2 sparrows danced above the garden fence. Her words aren't for others. They're for herself, to remember how she felt, to relive the small sacred details. She sometimes adds sketches, a leaf, a feather, a branch. Dried flowers rest between the pages like nature's bookmarks. When her granddaughter asked, "Why don't you post this online?" she smiled, "Because I write to remember who I am, not for others to see." Journaling to her is a ritual of gratitude, a way to stay connected, anchored, and whole. By noon, sunlight pours through the windows, and the pace of her day slows even more. Lunch is simple: a bowl of vegetable soup, a slice of whole grain bread, and a handful of fresh fruit. often from her own garden. She eats slowly, savoring every bite while watching birds bathe in the dust and her old cat nap under the lavender bush. Sometimes she naps. Other times, she picks up embroidery, working slowly on a forest scene stitched with earthy threads. Every stitch is a breath, a moment in the present. She often says, "When our hands are busy with something real, our mind comes home to now." These quiet afternoons are not about doing, they're about being. And in that being, she finds joy. As the sun begins to lower, casting golden light across the fields, Mrs. Evelyn knows another sacred moment has arrived. She carries a wooden chair to the garden or beside the stream and sits, facing the sunset. The forest glows, amber, soft, radiant, and everything seems to hold its breath. In that stillness, she remembers her late husband, their quiet evenings watching the sky, fingers gently intertwined. She believes true love doesn't end, it simply transforms. When the light fades, she folds her chair and walks home under a lilac sky, not with sadness, but with peace. When darkness settles, she lights a small candle lantern, wraps a shawl around her shoulders, and sits on the porch once again. The stars glitter above, crickets sing their chorus, and the forest whispers in hushed tones. She looks up and softly names the constellations, knowledge from her teaching days. On clear nights, she lays a thick blanket on the grass and lies down, feeling the earth beneath her and the universe above. In that moment, she doesn't feel small, she feels held. Before bed, she always says, "Thank you for today." That's all, but it's enough. Autumn paints the forest in gold, crimson, and bronze. To many, fall signals endings, but to Mrs. Evelyn, it's a season of profound lessons, how to let go. As leaves drift to the ground, she whispers silently with each one, letting go of old fears, past regrets, or heavy thoughts. She learns from trees. They don't resist the falling, they surrender beautifully. In her garden, she lets old lavender bushes and wilted daisies rest, honoring their cycles. She cleans the soil gently and plants new seeds, not expecting blossoms tomorrow, but trusting spring will come. She writes, "No one teaches gentle release better than a falling leaf." And from nature, she learns, every ending holds a new beginning. When winter arrives with its hush and frost, Mrs. Evelyn doesn't resist. She embraces it as a time for retreat, inward and quiet. Mornings start with ginger tea, orange peel incense, and soft candlelight. She reads old journals, knits warm scarves, and writes down dreams for the coming spring. Outside, trees stand bare but strong. She walks around her sleeping garden, whispers to the roots, and reminds them spring will return. Indoors, she tends to her space, cleaning, rearranging, and making room not just for comfort but for calm. Winter, she says, is not death, it's gestation. And in its silence, the seeds of joy are quietly preparing. Though she lives alone, Mrs. Evelyn never feels lonely. Her days are filled with connections, not to people, but to the living world around her. She names the animals who visit, Bruno the squirrel, Luna the stray cat, and the chorus of sparrows in the hedges. She doesn't own them, she simply welcomes them. She thanks the wind, greets the creek, and carries stones from her forest walks in her coat pocket, tangible reminders that she is never separate. She once said, "We are not above nature, we are of it, like leaves to the tree, like stars to the sky." These tiny, tender relationships form the web of her life, and through them, she is whole. Mrs. Evelyn's life wasn't a journey to seek something grand, but rather a journey of returning to nature, to inner stillness, and to her truest self. In a world growing louder and faster, she chose to live slowly, live green, and live truthfully, so that every moment held meaning and every action carried connection and gratitude. We don't need to live in the mountains or own a private garden to follow Mrs. Evelyn's path. Sometimes, just a moment of stillness under a tree, a gentle touch on the bark, or a calm morning by the window with deep breaths is enough to reconnect with nature and with ourselves. Mrs. Evelyn's story reminds us that nature doesn't only exist outside of us, it also lives within us. And when we care for nature, we're also nurturing our soul. Thank you for joining Aging Gracefully on this gentle and loving journey. If you saw a part of yourself in Mrs. Evelyn's story, don't forget to subscribe to explore more heartwarming, inspiring stories that help you live well, physically and mentally, at every age. See you in the next video.